There was a private company that owned an army of 250,000 soldiers, not a country. A company, a business with shareholders and a board of directors and an annual report headquartered in a building in London so modest it was only 5 windows wide. And from behind those 5 windows, that company ruled over 60 million people on the other side of the world. It collected their taxes. It waged their wars. It caused their famines. It even bought and sold human beings. At its height, its private army was twice the size of the entire British military, and it answered not to a king or a parliament, but to its investors. We are so used to the idea that countries conquer countries that we have almost forgotten this ever happened. But for the better part of a century, one of the largest territorial empires on Earth was not a nation at all. It was a corporation. This is the story of how a group of London merchants, chasing pepper and silk, accidentally built a company that swallowed a subcontinent, started a war that gave Britain Hong Kong, and lit the fuse on the American Revolution. And the most unsettling part is the single line written into its founding charter on the very first day that made all of it legal. It begins on the last day of the year 1600. Queen Elizabeth I signs a royal charter granting a group of London merchants a monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, a vast slice of the planet stretching from the bottom of Africa all the way to the far edge of the Pacific. The company they form has a clumsy, grand name, the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. History would just call it the East India Company. At the start, it was almost laughably small, 125 shareholders, a starting capital of £72,000, a single building, a handful of ships, and a great deal of ambition. On the surface, this was simply a business venture, and a clever one. The idea of letting ordinary investors buy shares in a trading voyage, pooling their money and sharing the risk and the reward, was a revolutionary financial instrument in the Tudor age. It would go on to transform the entire British economy and become the model for every joint stock company that followed. But hidden in that charter, alongside the right to trade, was something else. The charter granted the company the right to wage war. Hold on to that, because it is the seed of everything that follows. In the year 1600, nobody blinked at it. Trade in distant, lawless waters was dangerous, and a trading company might need to defend its ships. It read like a practical clause about self-defense. It was, in fact, a license for a private business to build a military and use it. The men who signed it were thinking about pirates. They had just handed a corporation the legal power to conquer. For the first century and a half, though, the company really was just a trader, and a vulnerable one. Its first voyage set out in 1601 in a repurposed pirate ship called the Red Dragon, sailed to the islands of what is now Indonesia, traded with a local sultan, raided a Portuguese vessel along the way, and came back laden with 900 tons of spices. That set the pattern. The company set up coastal trading posts, which it called factories, at places like Surat on the west coast of India, and it bargained and bribed its way into the good graces of the Mughal emperors who ruled most of India. In 1634, the Emperor Shah Jahan, the man who built the Taj Mahal, extended his hospitality to English traders in Bengal, the richest region of the empire. By 1717, the company had wangled something extraordinary. a royal order exempting it from paying customs duties in Bengal altogether, a colossal commercial advantage. And that is the thing to understand about the early company. In India, it was the small player. The Mughal Empire was, in the year 1700, very likely the richest empire on earth. The English were guests, tolerated because their trade was useful, regarded as amp and persistent, and largely harmless. For 150 years, the company traded in cotton, silk, indigo, saltpeter, sugar, and spices. It turned a profit, paid its dividends, and stayed in its lane. What changed everything was not a grand plan. It was opportunity and the slow collapse of the empire that had been keeping the company in check. It is worth pausing on one of those commodities, because it tells you what this company really was underneath the silk and the tea. Saltpeter. It sounds like nothing, but saltpeter is the key ingredient in gunpowder, and the company traded it in enormous quantities. It supplied the gunpowder that armed Britain's wars. One governor of the company was once reported as saying he would rather have the saltpeter made than collect the tax on salt, because the saltpeter mattered more to the war machine. So even in its supposedly innocent trading century, the company was already woven into the business of warfare, supplying the explosive that European armies ran on. This was never purely a company of merchants politely exchanging goods. From early on, it dealt in the materials of power, and there is a darker thread still, one that often gets left out entirely. The company also trafficked in human beings. From the 1730s to the 1770s, it transported enslaved people, most of them from East Africa, from Mozambique, and especially from Madagascar, to its holdings in India and elsewhere. It was never the company's main business, but it was part of the machine, and it belongs in the ledger. This was an organization that would trade in whatever returned a profit, whether that was pepper or gunpowder or people. By the middle of the 1700s, the Mughal Empire was fracturing. Central authority was weakening, regional rulers were breaking away, and India was becoming a patchwork of rival powers eyeing one another nervously. And into that instability stepped a company that by now had money, ships, ambition, and that old forgotten clause about the right to wage war. The turning point has a name and a date, and it is one of the most consequential and least understood moments in the entire history of money and power. The Battle of Plassey, the 23rd of June, 1757. The company's forces, led by a former clerk turned military commander named Robert Clive, faced the army of the Nawab of Bengal, the immensely wealthy ruler of one of the richest provinces in India. On paper, it was a slaughter waiting to happen. Clive had around 3,000 men. The Nawab had 50,000, with cavalry and war elephants and French allies. The company should have been annihilated. But Plassey was not won with soldiers. It was won with a bribe. Clive had secretly made a deal with the Nawab's own commander-in-chief, a man named Mir Jafar, promising to make him the new Nawab if he simply held his troops back when the fighting started. And that is exactly what happened. In the heat of the battle, a huge portion of the Nawab's army, by prior arrangement, just stood still. The Nawab's forces collapsed in confusion. The company won. And here is what they won. Plassey gave the East India Company effective control over the wealth of Bengal, one of the richest regions on the planet. A trading company now had its hands directly on the treasury of millions of people. The victory was not really a conquest. It was, in the truest sense, a corporate takeover executed by bribery, and its prize was not a market but a kingdom. Remember the bribe at Plassey, because it tells you what kind of empire this was always going to be. It did not rule by right, it ruled by leverage. After Plassey came Buxar in 1764, and this time the company won a genuine, hard-fought military victory against a combined army several times its size. The following year, it secured from the weakened Mughal Emperor Shah Alam a document called the Diwani, the legal right to collect taxes across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Pause on what that means, because it is the exact moment a business became a government. From 1600, the company had made its money the way any merchant does, by buying goods and selling them for more. Now it made its money by taxing an entire population. It no longer needed to trade fairly or to trade at all to profit. It could simply take. Tens of millions of people now lived under the authority of a company headquartered in London, working, in effect, to enrich its shareholders. And the men running it on the ground grew obscenely, famously rich. They came home so wealthy and so corrupt that English society invented a sneering word for them: nabobs, a mangling of an Indian word for a regional governor. They bought country estates, they bought seats in Parliament, and they paraded fortunes that everyone knew had been extracted from Bengal. Clive himself returned with a personal fortune that would be worth a staggering sum in today's money, and when Parliament later hauled him in to explain how he had come by it, he famously said that, considering all the opportunities he had had to enrich himself, he stood astonished at his own moderation. The historian William Dalrymple has described what the company did to Bengal in these years as perhaps the single largest transfer of wealth in history until the 20th century. The richest province of the richest empire on earth was, over a few decades, methodically stripped. Statues, jewels, and treasure flowed from the palaces of Bengal to the townhouses of the English countryside. And a region that had been the textile workshop of the world was deliberately turned into a captive market, forced to buy the machine-made cloth that British factories were about to start producing. The drain had begun. And here is the cost, the part that no honest telling gets to skip. In 1769 and 1770, Bengal was struck by drought and then by famine, and the company, now the tax-collecting ruler of Bengal, responded in the way a body designed only to generate revenue responds. It kept collecting taxes. By some accounts, it even raised them, and it enforced them brutally. Grain that might have fed the starving was, in places, hoarded or exported, because there was more profit in selling it than in giving it away. The result was catastrophe on a scale that is hard to hold in the mind. Estimates vary, but somewhere between a sixth and a third of the entire population of Bengal died. Millions upon millions of people. This was not a natural disaster that the company merely failed to prevent. It was a disaster that the company's priorities actively deepened, because the company was not built to govern or to care for the people it governed. It was built to return a profit to its shareholders, and it kept doing exactly that while Bengal starved. This is the heart of the whole story, and it is the argument worth sitting with. A nation, even a brutal conquering one, generally has some interest in the survival of its subjects, because subjects are the source of its long-term strength. A corporation, by its nature and by its legal design, has one overriding interest, which is revenue for its owners. When you let the second kind of organization rule the first kind of territory, the famine of Bengal is the kind of thing that happens. The right to wage war, signed so casually in 1600, had become the power to tax a people to death. And then, in a twist that almost no one expects, the company that had just bled a kingdom nearly went bankrupt. This is the part that exposes the whole machine. For all its conquered territory and its tax revenue, the company was wildly overextended, riddled with corruption and mismanagement, and by 1772 it was facing financial collapse. The famine had wrecked Bengal's productivity. Its warehouses in London were stuffed with 18 million pounds of tea that it was struggling to sell. Its costs were spiraling. And here is the truly remarkable thing. This private company had become so enormous, so entangled with the British economy, and so stuffed with shareholders who also sat in Parliament, that the government decided it was too big to fail. So the British state bailed it out. Parliament floated the company a loan to cover its shortfalls. And to help it clear those mountains of unsold tea, Parliament passed a law in 1773 called the Tea Act, designed to let the company dump its surplus tea directly onto the American colonies, undercutting local merchants and smugglers. A bailout and a rescue package for a private corporation deemed too important to be allowed to collapse. If that sounds familiar, it should. And the consequences of that bailout would cross an ocean, because the Americans did not take it well. The Tea Act handed the East India Company a monopoly on tea in the colonies, and to colonists already furious about being taxed by a parliament they had no vote in, this was the final insult. A giant, government-backed corporation being given a sweetheart deal to flood their markets. On the 16th of December 1773, a group of colonists in Boston, some of them disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in the harbor and threw the company's tea into the water. 342 chests of East India Company tea destroyed in a single night. We remember it as the Boston Tea Party, one of the sparks of the American Revolution. But notice what it actually was. The tea those colonists were hurling into the harbor was not the king's tea. It was the East India Company's tea. The revolution that created the United States was triggered in part by anger at a multinational corporation and the government that had bailed it out. The company was now so vast that its financial troubles in London could set fire to a continent on the other side of the Atlantic. And it was about to do something even more damaging on the other side of the world. The company had a problem with China. The British had developed an almost insatiable appetite for Chinese tea, but the Chinese wanted very little that Britain produced, and they demanded payment in silver. Silver was draining out of Britain eastward at an alarming rate. The company needed something, anything that it could sell to China to reverse that flow. And it found one: opium. In 1773, the very same year as the Tea Act, the company took for itself a monopoly on opium production in Bengal. It grew the drug in India, and although it was careful not to carry the opium into China on its own official ships, it sold it to private traders on the explicit understanding that they would smuggle it into China in open defiance of Chinese law. By the 1820s, the opium trade had grown so large that it was paying for most of the tea Britain bought. Roughly 900 tons of the drug a year were being funneled into China, creating mass addiction and social devastation, all to balance a trading account. When the Chinese government finally moved to crush the trade, imposing the death penalty on smuggling and destroying huge stocks of the drug, Britain responded with warships. The First Opium War broke out at the end of the 1830s. China lost. And among the spoils Britain took from that war was a small island it would hold for more than a century and a half, Hong Kong, an entire war fought to protect a drug smuggling operation that had begun as a corporation's accounting fix. And eventually, all of this became the thing that even the British state could no longer ignore. Not the conquest exactly, and not at first the suffering, but the sheer wrongness and danger of the arrangement. A private company with an army twice the size of the nation's own, ruling 60 million people, enriching a handful of men, triggering revolutions and wars, occasionally needing to be rescued by the taxpayer and accountable to no one but its shareholders. It was a state within a state, and no real state can tolerate that forever. So Parliament began, slowly, to pull the company back. The Regulating Act of 1773, Pitt's India Act of 1784, which placed political control under a government board, a series of charter acts that stripped away the company's trade monopoly with India in 1813, and then with China in 1833, until the great trading company barely traded at all, and existed mainly as the administrative machine running India on the government's behalf. The company had become so fused with the British state that you could no longer tell where the business ended and the empire began. And then came the year that ended it. In 1857, a massive rebellion erupted across northern and central India, beginning among the company's own Indian soldiers, the sepoys, and spreading into a vast uprising against company rule. It was savage on every side. The causes ran deep, and decades of company misrule were among them. The British put the rebellion down, but the shock of it forced a final reckoning. A private company could no longer be permitted to hold a subcontinent. In 1858, the British Crown formally took direct control of India, absorbing the company's territories, its administration, and its 250,000-strong army into the state. This was the beginning of what we call the British Raj. The East India Company itself lingered on as a hollow shell for another decade and a half before it was quietly dissolved in 1874. The company that had conquered India died not in battle, but by an act of paperwork. Its empire simply handed over to the government that had let it run wild for 100 years. So look back at the whole arc of it. A trading company is founded to buy pepper with 125 shareholders and a single building. Buried in its charter is the right to wage war. An empire it depended on collapses, an opportunity appears, and a bribe at placé hands it the wealth of a kingdom. Within a few years, it rules tens of millions, drains their wealth in what may be the largest such transfer in history, and presides over a famine that kills a vast share of a province, all while paying dividends. It trades in gunpowder, and for a time in human beings. It grows an army larger than its own nations. It becomes too big to fail, and is bailed out by the state, and that bailout helps spark the American Revolution. It hooks a quarter of humanity on opium to fix its tea accounts and starts a war that wins Britain-Hong Kong, and it is finally swallowed by the very state that had let it run for a century. We tell the story of the British Empire as the story of a nation, but the foundation of British power in India, and a great deal of the wealth that flowed back to build the grand houses and fund the banks of the home country, was not laid by a country at all. It was laid by a corporation, acting in the interests of its shareholders, doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was to make money, with no natural limit and no conscience, and, for far too long, no one to answer to. The most powerful empire builder in British history was not a king or a general. It was a company 5 windows wide, and the line that made all of it possible was written on the very first day when someone decided that a business should be allowed to wage war, and nobody stopped to ask what would happen if it won.